After 1945, when the fighting ended and the various fronts were deoccupied, things that no one had seen since the war days began to appear, not only in Germany, but also in rural areas of the United Kingdom, on Pacific coasts, in Eastern European towns, or in former Allied bases. Remnants that were still there, buried, sealed, or simply forgotten, began to emerge. Some appeared by accident. Others came out when excavating land, opening tunnels, or checking closed facilities. They were objects, vehicles, messages, structures, or complete spaces that had been frozen in time. Many were not intentionally stored, they were just abandoned where the war left them. Each find showed something different: how they fought, how resources were moved, how they survived, or how they fled. And even though decades have passed, fragments that no one had seen are still appearing. What were these finds that appeared so long after, and why were they still hidden? When they started digging under what now functions as a school in Vilnius, no one thought that something so old and so full of history could still be hidden there. But upon removing the earth, remains buried for decades appeared. What archaeologists found was part of the Great Synagogue of Vilnius, an enormous temple that was destroyed during the Nazi occupation. There, under the ground, the foundations of the mikveh, some pieces of furniture, study utensils, and fragments of objects used by the Jewish community were still standing. Vilnius, at one time, was a city with one of the largest concentrations of Jewish population in all of Europe. They called it the Jerusalem of the North, and it was no exaggeration. But in 1941, when the German troops entered, everything changed. The city was taken, families were removed from their homes, and temples were attacked. Tens of thousands of people were murdered or taken to camps, and the synagogue, which had been a central point in the life of the neighborhood, was left in ruins. Afterward, with the entry of the Soviets, what remained of the place was completely razed. In its place, a school was built. The land was leveled, and no one spoke of what had been there again. For many years, no one thought anything remained underneath. But recent excavations showed that not everything had been lost. The archaeologists, upon opening the ground, found remains that had not been touched since the 1940s. The pieces, despite the time, were still in good condition, as if someone had hidden them on purpose. Due to the way they were placed, it seemed that during the attacks, someone had wanted to save what they could and buried it in a hurry. These were not just any relics, but real parts of the daily life of a community that no longer existed. For researchers, what was there was not just ruins, it was physical proof of a devastated culture. This find brought visibility back to something that many already considered forgotten. In another part of Europe, several hundred kilometers away, another discovery was made by chance. At an airbase in the Netherlands, a museum team was cleaning one of the bomb craters that still remained from the fighting. What at first seemed like just another hole among many others turned out to be much more. As they removed debris, metallic parts began to emerge, and after a few hours they realized they had found remains of a plane. But it wasn't a common plane. It was a Messerschmitt Me 262, the first jet fighter to fly in combat, developed by the Germans in the last years of the war. The plane was buried under layers of earth, as if it had been hidden on purpose. The most surprising thing was the condition it was in. Although it had visible damage, the cannons mounted on the front, the thick glass windshield, and even fragments of the wings that retained their shape could be clearly seen. The way it had been covered suggested that it wasn't the result of an accident, but an intentional decision. Perhaps, seeing that the war was being lost, someone chose to bury the plane before it was taken by the Allies. The Me 262 was one of the Nazi regime's strongest bets to change the course of the conflict. Its speed and design made it far superior to traditional propeller fighters. However, it arrived too late and could never be manufactured or used in sufficient quantity to make a difference. What made this find special was that for the first time an almost complete specimen could be seen in the same place where it had been left. It was not a replica or a museum piece brought from another country. It was the original plane, just as it was left in the last days of the war. Since its recovery, it has become a direct example of how technology, even the most advanced, is not enough when time runs out. At the other end of the continent, a very different story had been told for decades. According to some British veterans at the end of the war, a large number of Spitfire planes had been buried in Burma, which is now Myanmar. The version said that these planes, new and unused, were sent as part of an operation, but that when the conflict ended and there was no way to bring them back, they were buried underground to prevent them from falling into enemy hands or being abandoned outdoors. For years, the story remained a rumor. There was talk of covered runways, sealed boxes, and testimonies that claimed to have seen the planes before they were covered with earth and cement. But nothing was confirmed, until a British historical aircraft hunter decided to take the matter seriously. He travelled to the country several times, interviewed local witnesses, studied maps from the time, and compared military records. He even managed to get his country's Prime Minister to support the excavation project. Money was raised, a team of archaeologists was assembled, and the exact spot where, according to the story, the Spitfires were buried was chosen. Expectations were enormous. If it was true, they would be recovering new planes, enclosed in sealed boxes, kept like a military time capsule. But after weeks of work, they did not find a single plane. The ground measurements showed that something had been removed or altered in that place, but there were no clear remains. For many, it was proof that the story was false. For others, the fact that the ground was altered indicated that perhaps someone had already removed the planes much earlier. The truth is that, despite the effort, there was no find. But the attempt was not in vain. It became one of the best-known cases of modern archaeological search linked to the Second World War. Although there was no physical result, it served to show how certain war stories remain alive, even when the protagonists are no longer there. In addition, it made it clear that not all mysteries will have a closed ending, and that sometimes history is also made up of attempts, searches, and gaps that are not filled. But not everything remained underground or forgotten among buildings. In the sea, too, some discoveries took decades to appear. One of the most anticipated cases was that of the USS Indianapolis, a United States warship that played a key role in the last days of the conflict. In July of 1945, this cruiser was responsible for transporting fundamental parts of the first atomic bomb from California to the island of Tinian, where the attack on Hiroshima was being prepared. It was a secret, fast, and unescorted mission. After completing the delivery, the ship continued on its way, but in the middle of the Pacific, it was attacked by a Japanese submarine. The impact was direct and sank the ship in just 12 minutes. Of the more than 1,100 men on board, only 316 survived. The others died from injuries, dehydration, or shark attacks while waiting for help that took several days to arrive. The sinking of the Indianapolis was one of the worst naval disasters in the history of the United States Navy. For a long time, its location was unknown. The exact site of the shipwreck remained undiscovered for more than 70 years. It wasn't until 2017 that a private exploration team managed to find the remains at a depth of almost 6,000 meters. The ship was almost intact, resting on the seabed. Some areas showed the damage caused by the torpedoes, but much of the structure was still standing, even with the turret and parts of the hull still recognizable. This discovery not only closed one of the most painful chapters for the surviving sailors, but also provided access to detailed images of how a ship that had been part of one of the most delicate moments of the war was left. Everything was recorded and documented by underwater cameras. The find became a direct reference for understanding how naval operations developed in the Pacific during that final stretch of the conflict. That wasn't the only case of a large military vessel found so many years later. The USS Yorktown, another United States aircraft carrier, also appeared on the seabed after decades without its exact whereabouts being known. This ship had been key during the Battle of Midway in 1942. During that engagement, the Yorktown was hit by Japanese planes and severely damaged. Despite attempts to tow it, the ship could not withstand the damage and ended up sinking. At that moment, it was believed that there was no way to recover anything. The only thing known was that it had been left somewhere in the ocean, without clear markings. More than 50 years passed without any signs. In 1998, the oceanographer who had also found the remains of the Titanic and the battleship Bismarck led an expedition that managed to locate it. It was more than 4,000 meters underwater. When the cameras showed it for the first time, it became clear that the ship had withstood the elements like a sealed capsule. The hull was intact. The name markings were visible, and the internal equipment, although rusted, remained in place. Even the paint was recognizable. The Yorktown was one of the first cases where a sunken ship from that era could be studied in such detail. Thanks to its condition, it became a kind of underwater museum that showed what life was like aboard during those battles. Unlike other shipwrecks that were destroyed by explosions, this one retained a clear form, as if it could still be explored internally. The find also served to improve deep water search techniques. The team that worked on that mission later applied those same methods to other cases, but above all, it confirmed that much of the war's naval history remained underwater, waiting to be found. The remains of the Yorktown are now monitored as submerged heritage, with no plans for physical recovery, but with restricted access for scientific missions. Thus, what had been a loss was transformed into a visual reference point about what happened on one of the most decisive fronts of the conflict. Not all discoveries came from the seabed. In some old houses in England, small but powerful traces of what daily life was like during the war can still come to light. In Surrey, in the south of the country, a man decided to restore a fireplace in his country house. While cleaning it inside, he stumbled upon branches, old ashes, and something else. Among the remains, he found the dry body of a pigeon. It didn't seem out of the ordinary until he noticed it had a capsule tied to its leg. When he opened it, a very thin, rolled-up paper appeared, with a handwritten message. It wasn't in English, nor in plain text. It was an encrypted message. The man handed it over to the authorities, and it then reached the specialists at Bletchley Park, the centre where German codes had been deciphered during the war. After reviewing the content, it was confirmed to be a military message, encrypted with the system used by the Enigma machine. It could not be fully deciphered, but experts confirmed that it was a communication sent from German-occupied territory to the British command. The pigeon, apparently, had been released to cross the channel and deliver the message, but for some reason, instead of reaching its destination, it landed in that chimney and got trapped. It died there, with the message still on its leg. What makes this find so unique is not only the story behind it, but the fact that the message remained intact for more than 70 years, hidden in such an everyday place. During the war, more than 250,000 pigeons were used as part of the communication system. They were fast, could fly long distances, and could not be tracked by enemy radio systems. They were sent with key messages, often at times when there was no other form of contact. This case showed that even today, an original piece of that system can still appear, with content that had not been seen by anyone since the day it was written. The message, though brief, showed a real military structure, and was intended to be read by officers who knew how to decipher that type of code. The fact that it remained in a common house for all those years, unnoticed by anyone, makes this find one of the rarest related to the secret communication network of the Second World War. Just as buried objects and sunken ships continue to come to light, fragments of paper, animals used in combat, and the simplest tools continue to appear where least expected. The war left visible marks on cities, but it also hid stories among bricks, roofs, seas, and chimneys. And although the conflict ended more than 7 decades ago, there are still messages waiting to be found, and missions that were only closed when someone read them again. What happened with the pigeon and its hidden message in a chimney was not an exception. In many places across the United Kingdom, direct traces of what it was like to live through the war from the inside still appear. Years after it all ended, a family in Coventry was renovating their garden when they noticed a metallic structure beneath the earth. It wasn't just a simple rusted lid. Carefully removing the soil, they uncovered the entrance to a family air raid shelter that had been hidden since the 1940s. It was one of those improvised bunkers built in backyards during German bombings, but this one wasn't empty. Inside there were benches, old wires, bottles, cans, toolboxes, remnants of lanterns, and even documents. The current homeowners never knew it was there. When they went down, they realized it wasn't just a shelter. It seemed like a time capsule. Everything left inside was practically intact, protected by the earth and the sealed structure. They even found wooden toys and a portable radio from that era. The air had that stale smell of something unopened for decades, but nothing was rotten or burned. The family decided not to empty it, but to preserve it as it was. Over time, the media called it the shelter frozen in time. The special thing about this find was not only what it contained, but that it showed how ordinary people lived in those days. It wasn't a military post or an official hideout. It was a homemade bunker built to protect against bombs falling from the sky. Every object inside told how they prepared for something that could happen at any moment. The unopened cans, the rolled blankets, the spare lamps, everything was there as if someone were going to return that night. But no one did. The shelter was covered and forgotten. Its reappearance, untouched by anyone, made this find one of the most complete records of civilian life during the bombings. While that was happening in a regular house, surprises no one expected were also emerging elsewhere on the continent. Near a Czech village, parts of a rare military vehicle not found in usual records were discovered. It was a German Army half-track tractor known as the SDKFZ 251. At first glance, it looked like a hybrid between a truck and a tank, with wheels at the front and tracks at the back. The curious thing is that it wasn't a common model. Very few were manufactured during the war, and most were used as cargo, towing, or mobile rocket launcher vehicles. The one that appeared was partially buried, but with an almost complete structure. Despite being rusted, the shapes of the engine, the suspension system, and the upper turret were distinguishable. Upon inspection, specialists confirmed that it was one of the models armed with multiple launchers, which made it even rarer. It's believed that this type of vehicle was used in wooded areas where roads were poor and rapid mobility was needed. The find was confirmed by armored vehicle experts, who identified the remains by the chassis and manufacturing number. The remains were transported to a workshop where their restoration began, not to make them functional again, but to preserve their form. The SDKFZ 251 tractor had been primarily used between 1943 and 1945, but many were destroyed or abandoned during the German retreat. This one, however, was complete. There were even paint marks on the sides. What surprised researchers was that no one had discovered it before. It was in a rural area, not far from an old military road, but for decades no one had noticed it. The find also provided clues about the routes some units used to retreat inland. Following this discovery, other nearby points where more remains might have been left were tracked. Although not all SDKFZ 251 tractors were alike, this model was one of the rarest, and its condition made it a highly valuable documentary piece. It showed how military machinery adapted to difficult terrain and how certain prototypes were used in very specific situations, far from the main fronts. Not far from that area, in the forested hills of Thuringia, Germany, there was another find that attracted attention due to its size and mystery. It was a tunnel system known as Mittelberg. For years, Allied intelligence services had suspected that something important was hidden there. When they managed to enter in 1945, they found a network of underground passages with chambers, reinforced ceilings, half-finished structures, and heavy equipment. The strange thing was that no one knew for sure what it had been made for. Some said it was a last-minute bunker for Hitler and his circle. Others believed it was a hidden armaments factory. The truth is that the constructions were well made, with access through hatches, ventilation, treated walls, and armored doors. Nothing was complete, but everything indicated that the work had been done in a hurry. In the documents that were found, there were no clear plans. Many reports were vague or contradictory. The captured officers also did not give precise data. The corridors connected to areas where there were only pillars, empty rooms, and unfinished structures. Some fragments of paper suggested that an experimental plant was being attempted to be set up there, but no functional machinery was found. The place was marked by the suspicion that it could have had a nuclear use, although it was never confirmed. Over time, it became a restricted area. Part of the tunnels collapsed and others were sealed. Those who managed to enter later discovered marks on the walls, remains of construction materials, and some mechanisms. There were no signs that anyone had lived there, but that work had been done tirelessly. Mittelberg remained one of the last unresolved projects of the Nazi regime, a complex that absorbed resources and labor until the last days, but that never became operational. The magnitude of the galleries showed that it was more than a simple hideout. The design pointed to something broader, but when the regime fell, everything stopped. The Allies took what little there was of value, and the rest was buried. Since then, the site has been reviewed several times, but without a clear conclusion. Some see it as the final attempt to build an alternative command center. Others think it was just a distraction, a way to spend resources to maintain the illusion of resistance. The only certainty is that Mittelberg existed, was excavated quickly, and remained one of the most enigmatic structures of the last stage of the conflict. The Mittelberg tunnels weren't the only ones built against the clock in the regime's final months. In another part of Germany, south of Lower Saxony, the Allies unearthed another equally striking underground system, though with a much clearer purpose. Deep within the Harz mountain range, amidst thick forests and little-travelled roads, they discovered subterranean facilities where heavy weaponry had been manufactured during the war's final phase. The idea was to evade constant Allied bombings by concealing production beneath solid mountains. Upon entering these subterranean galleries, they found machinery still in place, rails, remnants of wagons, tools and signs of forced labour. The factories were connected by long passages, featuring reinforced walls and high ceilings to accommodate large components. Unlike other sites that had barely begun excavation, here production had genuinely been underway. They found projectile parts, control panels, disassembled engines and already labelled metal pieces. Allied engineers inspecting the site confirmed that the factory had been active until very shortly before the troops arrived. The facility was so vast that it couldn't be fully explored in a single day. Over several days they opened closed doors, unblocked corridors, and uncovered rooms still filled with tools. It was also confirmed that prisoners had worked there, many under extreme conditions. Marks on the walls, makeshift mattresses and empty water containers hinted at the forced life endured within. This was an underground network with hidden production lines that had fabricated components for tanks, missiles and airplanes. It was the regime's response to the Allied air offensive. Move everything possible underground, no matter the cost. Following the discovery, several of these factories were sealed, while others remained open for military inspection. The sheer size of the Harz complex, coupled with its level of actual activity, made it one of the clearest examples of how the war shifted underground in its final phase. Further west in the city of Frankfurt, Allied soldiers discovered something different, but equally shocking. While inspecting banking facilities that had been taken over by the regime, they uncovered hidden vaults containing items that didn't appear in any official inventory. These weren't gold bars or financial documents. What was inside were jewels, watches, wedding rings, gold dentures, ancient coins and personal objects clearly taken by force from Jewish families. Many of the pieces had engraved names, dates or religious inscriptions. They were organized in boxes, numbered, and stored in compartments protected by special locks. What was most striking was the quantity. These weren't just a few objects. It was a systematic, extensive collection, accumulated over years. Everything indicated that these assets had been confiscated during deportations and then secretly stored, possibly with the intention of using them as economic collateral. There were highly valuable pieces, but also common objects that only made sense when considering a network of massive looting. After their discovery, a process began to catalogue each item, attempting to cross-reference them with victim lists. Some objects could be returned to surviving families, but most were never claimed. The find served as direct physical proof of the systematic looting operated by the Nazi regime. This wasn't individual pillaging, but a structured policy to take everything of value from those who were persecuted, classify it, and hide it as if it were state property. In the same building, documents were also found with names, dates, and signatures of the officials responsible for these operations. The existence of these vaults not only confirmed the accounts of those who had managed to escape Germany alive, but also provided investigators with concrete evidence to track other similar networks in other cities. Based on what was found in Frankfurt, archives in other regions began to be reviewed, and it was discovered that many pieces had been moved to Switzerland, Austria, or hidden in private properties. But what appeared in those vaults was one of the most comprehensive, intact and direct collections of organized looting that accompanied the extermination. Further west, on the coast of the Baltic Sea, another place continued to attract attention for a different reason. On the island of Usedom in northern Germany was what had been one of the most advanced centers of military development during the war, Peenemünde. In this complex, under the direction of engineer Werner von Braun, the V-1 and V-2 rockets were designed and tested, the first automatic long-range ballistic weapons. The place functioned as a test base and assembly center. Although the Allies bombed the area on several occasions, many remains survived. Decades later, buried structures, transport tunnels, rails used to move the missiles, and actual pieces of the launched rockets began to emerge. Some were in large pieces, others reduced to fragments, but all with visible marks of the model, serial number and production date. Plans, technical notes, operators' uniforms, and photographs of the launches were also found. What made this place unique was that it had been the first step towards what would later become modern space technology. The difference was that, at that time, rockets were used to attack cities. London, Antwerp, and other areas were hit by the V-2 rockets in the final phase of the war. They made no noise when falling. They could not be intercepted, and they left thousands dead. The discovery of these remains helped to understand the manufacturing process, what materials were used, and how work shifts were organized. In many cases, those who assembled the rockets were prisoners, forced to work in extreme conditions. Peenemünde was more than a base. It was the center of a scientific program developed in the midst of the conflict. Today, part of the place is preserved as a museum, but many of its areas remain closed to the public. The recently found structures showed passages that did not appear in the original plans, indicating that there were parts of the project that were never fully revealed. The remains of the missiles, when analyzed, provided exact details of their operation. The combustion marks, stabilization systems, and valves were more advanced than previously thought. This finding not only provided technical context to the terror caused by these weapons, but also helped to understand how the race for technological power was already underway before the war ended. What began in Peenemünde ended years later in the development of space rockets, but during that period, every piece found pointed to one thing. Next-level technology was being manufactured in the midst of the century's most destructive conflict. Each of these finds allowed us to see what the war left behind untold. They weren't theories or symbols, but physical evidence of abandoned structures, halted plans, escape routes, human remains, and personal objects left where everything ended. Some revealed how fighting took place, others, how people fled or hid what shouldn't be seen. In many cases, they were found in the same places where thousands died, without record or name. And although decades have passed, not everything has come to light. There are still unopened tunnels, unearthed boxes, buried pieces, lost documents, and spaces that no one has touched since 1945. What has already been found helps to understand what happened. What remains continues to wait underground, in the water, or wherever the war left it.